Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales About History, and I'm your host, Mike Allen. Here at Amazing Tales, we have done quite a few episodes on the Revolutionary War era in America, and today, we've got another one. However, you're not going to find today's story in most history books. And I can thank our guest for today for enlightening me about this one. Our guest, Dr. Robert Seelig. He's the chief consultant to the National Park Service for the Rochambeau Trail in the United States. Now, that's a trail that the French General Rochambeau and his 5,000 troops marched from Rhode Island to Yorktown, Virginia, to join George Washington for the final face-off against the British to end the Revolutionary War. Bob is making his sixth appearance on Amazing Tales today with perhaps his most incredible story yet, the arrest of Rochambeau by a local sheriff. He's going to be along momentarily with this story. This week's trivia question: it wasn't water that killed 21 Boston residents in the flash flood back in 1919. What was it? Stay tuned after the main program for the answer, because that will give you the topic for next week's show. Okay, a very quick review of French General Rochambeau's contribution during the Revolutionary War. He was sent with 5,000 troops by the King of France to help the Patriots beat the British in the Revolutionary War. Now, his forces marched from Rhode Island to Virginia 680 miles, joining with the Continental Army and General George Washington in the final siege of the war, the Siege of Yorktown. Well, after the fighting, he turned around and marched his troops back to Rhode Island to board their ships and sail back to France. Along the way, they had to camp at numerous locations, and Dr. Bob Seelig has helped the National Park Service, as well as many state and local historical groups, put together the fine touch on these specific campsites, dates of encampment, and many other related details. Today's episode focuses on a particularly long stay, several weeks, on the way back to Rhode Island that took place in Westchester County, New York, in the town of Yorktown. Not to be confused with Yorktown, Virginia, where that final fight occurred. We're talking about Yorktown, New York. Now, Rochambeau's forces stayed largely on property owned by a miller, that is, a man who ran a grist mill, grinding wheat into flour. Now, by all accounts, that miller, Samuel Delavan, was a good man and an avowed patriot, but he is not going to be remembered for that. Here with our story is Dr. Bob Seelig. Well, Bob, it's good to have you back on the program, and I am thrilled to talk to you today because we're going to be talking about a different Yorktown than we normally talk about. Not Yorktown, Virginia so much as Yorktown, New York. This was Rochambeau going through Yorktown, New York on his way to Yorktown, Virginia, and on his way back. Now, Yorktown, New York had a pretty strategic location, not too far from the Hudson River, which, of course, the French army had to get across to go down to Virginia. They picked this area in near what is today modern-day Yorktown Heights, New York. After the victory in Yorktown, Virginia, they're coming back because on the way down they only spent a night or two. On the way back, though, they're going to spend 3 to 4 weeks there, and they didn't have any water, did they?
You're absolutely correct. On the way back from Yorktown, the Siege of Yorktown, in the summer and early fall, French forces encamped in what is today Yorktown Heights, but which was known as Crown Pond. There is water there, obviously, because there's a creek around, but we have to keep in mind that it was a teeny tiny little village with a couple dozen inhabitants, and now suddenly you get the whole French army, something like 5,000 people, officers, soldiers, servants, cattle, wagon drivers, etc. A good-sized town suddenly coming there and encamping there, and the demands on natural resources, be that water, be that firewood, be that food for the animals, etc., of course, grows exponentially. And there is where this water issue arises, I think, that you were referring to in your introduction.
So what does Rochambeau do? There's the old saying that the devil loves idle hands, but he kept his troops busy by doing what?
He keeps his troops busy by increasing the water supply for his troops. But as he does that, as he's widening the creek there that goes around Yorktown Heights, like horseshoe shape, he also increases and improves the water supply for two mills that are farther downstream. The water supply for these mills increases as the creek gets wider and straightened out, etc. Initially, he clearly does this to improve the supply situation for his troops and the animals that come with his troops, hundreds of horses, cattle, etc.
So now on their way back toward Rhode Island, they stop, and he has to, of course, have his headquarters building, and his staff finds him a place at a home owned by a man named Samuel Delavan. Tell us what we know about Samuel Delavan.
Well, Samuel Delavan has a spotless Patriot record. He's born in March of 1752. He's a captain in the 3rd Regiment of Westchester County Militia, July 18, 1778. His house is actually George Washington's headquarters. There is the story that as Washington rides into New York City at the end of the war, it is Delavan's regiment of Westchester County Militia that actually accompanies Washington into New York City. That's what we know about him. But of course, you only leave a trace in history if you're really, really good or really, really bad. And today, Delavan is much better known for his activities when French forces are leaving the encampment at Yorktown Heights.
As they're leaving, and as I've read your papers, as I understand it, there's several different, slightly different versions of what exactly transpired. Why don't you tell me the one that you think is most plausible and just tell the story of what's one of the most absurd moments in military history, much less Revolutionary War history? What did Delavan undertake to do to Rochambeau?
Delavan's property is obviously also used by Rochambeau's soldiers. And as Rochambeau prepares to leave, the sheriff of the county appears and tells him that he had toured the property and had observed that the troops had done quite a bit of damage and that Mr. Delavan wanted to be reimbursed for the damage the troops had done. That in itself is interesting because Rochambeau was always very meticulous to pay for whatever resources he used and whatever damage his troops did. The sheriff that comes with Mr. Delavan reads out to Rochambeau what is basically an arrest warrant, saying that he very much recognizes all the good things, wonderful things the French had done and at Yorktown, etc. However, since there's damage that has not been paid for so far, he is here with the owner of the property to demand this payment. Otherwise, he will have to arrest Rochambeau. And at this point, Mr. Delavan apparently grabbed Rochambeau on one shoulder and the sheriff on the other shoulder as a sign that Rochambeau is now arrested. That must have come as a great surprise to Rochambeau, and there's an account that the office just started laughing outright, and we're just about ready to throw Delavan and the sheriff out of the house or chase him away if this happened in front of the house. As you said, there's half a dozen accounts of what happened, but those are all French accounts. We don't have an American account. What is interesting, though, is that rather than allowing his officers or his grenadiers or soldiers around to, arrest Delavan and the sheriff and drag him away or beat him up, Rochambeau simply says that, well, you may have the right or not to arrest me. But Rochambeau seemed more surprised than angered by that. And then, according to Closen, if I may quote him, Rochambeau said, that out of respect for the laws of the country, Rochambeau wanted to pardon the sheriff for what he had done because of his ignorance and in executing and the lack of training. But instead, he instructed his supply officer here to go along with Delavan and the sheriff to look at the damage that was done and get three men together to estimate the damage that actually was still there that had not been paid for. The damage is firewood the soldiers had burned, and Delavan says these were mostly fence rails for fences around his fields that he had put up to keep cattle in, etc., which is, always the first firewood that soldiers would use because it's nice and dry and split already. It's just interesting, for one thing, that Delavan and the sheriff come when Rochambeau is leaving after the soldiers had been there for a couple of weeks already. But the sheriff, too, realizes apparently that he had overstepped his boundaries. French soldiers, officers say that he was kind of nervous. And according to Closen, the sheriff says, "Please, Your Excellency, I beg you will allow me, after the performance of my duty, to withdraw unmolested." The long and short of the story is that a considerably lower amount of damages was agreed upon, which Rochambeau paid. However, the whole issue then appeared before the governor of New York, Clinton, as a result of these complaints and trials and what have you. The miller is ordered to pay all expenses, so at the end, there's nothing in it for him at all, other than maybe that he is still known today, 250 years almost after he had tried to arrest Rochambeau for damage that his soldiers had done to his property.
So the mill owner gets nothing. I understand the sheriff lost his job over this too, correct?
That's quite possible, yeah, that he lost his job over this as well.
And I heard that George Washington, upon hearing about this, was livid.
Yes, he was as well. It could be interpreted as a sign of ingratitude and greed, clearly. If Delavan had approached Rochambeau or a supply officer or whatever, say, could you still pay me a little money for the fence rails that were burned, etc., he would have gotten paid without the whole rigmarole, without of the sheriff and an arrest warrant, etc., etc.
Now, there's one final chapter to this story that is something I certainly was unaware of, and it has nothing to do with Compound or Yorktown Heights, New York. It has to do with the French Revolution. When Rochambeau went back to France and he was facing a tribunal, this case came up, didn't it?
That is correct. Rochambeau first was recalled into service when the Revolution broke out, served valiantly, but as the revolution became more and more radical, Rochambeau became suspect as a noble officer of just having become the last marshal of France, and he's arrested and put on trial. And that is when this issue here of an event of Compound appears, because Rochambeau's tact in dealing with Delavan, his respect for private property, his respect for the rights of really common folk whom he could have just arrested or told his soldiers to beat him up, etc., was used in Rochambeau's favor. The fact that he respected the laws of the land, which could force even someone like Rochambeau to pay for damages, is clearly held in his favor. Whether that actually saves his life or not, I'm not sure. I think his life was saved because Robespierre fell just in time and Rochambeau was released. But it is an example how widely known this event was within the officer corps, whether they wrote about it in their memoirs or not. You just never know what good can come out of your actions at a time like what happened at Crampon between Rochambeau and Mr. Delavan.
Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales About History. You know, if Patriot forces had been staying on Samuel Delavan's land, they wouldn't have had to pay for anything. The French, in most cases, were a welcome sight because they had lots of money, paid for their goods and services, and then went on to help the Patriots win independence from the British. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Dr. Robert Seelig. He is Chief Consultant to the National Park Service for the Rochambeau Trail. The answer to this week's trivia question. The question was, it wasn't water that killed 21 Boston residents in a flash flood back in 1919. What was it? The answer, molasses. Millions and millions of gallons of the thick, gooey material. Next week on Amazing Tales, the story behind the Great Molasses Flood of 1919, which led to the first class action lawsuit in this country, as well as new and stricter building codes. Amazing Tales About History is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.